At that birth of the Bronze Age, where empires carved their names in stone and blood, where the hanging gardens of Babylon defied heaven and ziggurats pierced the clouds like spears forever, the most daring experiment in human history was silently unfolding. Here, among nations that worshipped golden gods and sacrificed children in furnaces, a single voice would call for a revolution that would overturn every throne, every temple, every civilization that seemed as permanent as the mountains. From the temple-crowned cities of Mesopotamia to the competitive hills of Canaan, through Egyptian slavery and desert wanderings, conquest and captivity, a thread weaves through the tapestry of millennia, the rise and fall of ancient Israel. It is the story of shepherds who became kings, the story of slaves who tore apart empires, the story of a nation that lost everything but preserved what no sword could destroy. Through conquest and exile, in palaces and caves, their pact with the unseen will reshape not only their own destiny, but also the spiritual architecture of the world beyond the great rivers of Mesopotamia, where ziggurats pierce the sky like fingers reaching heavenward. A Bronze Age world sprawls beneath a blazing sun. Across the Fertile Crescent, city-states rise and fall. Babylon, with its hanging gardens of Chaldea, where merchants count silver and priests read ominous messages from the flight of birds. In this tapestry of nations, Canaan sits as a jewel among empires. Its coastal plains are green with grain, its hills purple with vineyards. Here, Amorite kings rule from fortified cities, while Egyptian caravans wind their way through the mountain passes. Among these ancient nations, where the gods dwell in the stone temples of Hun, a voice will call for a revolution that will reshape the spiritual landscape of mankind. From the temple-crowned ziggurat, a voice like thunder speaks to the heart of a man, bidding him leave his country, his people, and his father's family for a land unseen. Abram of that time, still called Abram, hears words that cut through the din of trade and commerce like a bronze sword through silk. As Abraham gathers his family and faces the setting sun, he carries more than silver and cattle. He carries the seed of a sacred oath that will grow into a tree whose branches shelter the nations. This caravan of destiny flows westward, past the great bend of the Euphrates, where the merchants of Haran claim to be prophets. Here death claims Terah, and here the heavenly covenant takes full form. The Almighty promises to make him a great nation in order to bless him and make his name great, declaring that all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through him. The three elements form the golden chain of this covenant, a land flowing with milk and honey. The descendants are as numerous as the stars in the vault of heaven, and the divine grace that flows through this chosen lineage to touch every tribe under the circle of the sun. The caravan of destiny flows westward, past the great bend of the Euphrates, where the merchants of Haran claim to be prophets. Here death claims Terah, and here the heavenly covenant takes full form. The Almighty promises to make him a great nation in order to bless him and make his name great, declaring that all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through him. The three elements form the golden chain of this covenant, a land flowing with milk and honey. The descendants are as numerous as the stars in the vault of heaven, and the divine grace that flows through this chosen lineage to touch every tribe under the circle of the sun. The caravan of destiny flows westward, past the great bend of the Euphrates, where the merchants of Haran claimed to be prophets. In this land, the birth of a new faith lays its foundation. The south of the mountains follows the path of Abraham. By Jerusalem, where Melchizedek reigns as king, priest of Almighty God. This mysterious figure comes out of the city gates carrying bread and wine. The Creator of heaven and earth blesses the patriarch as a favored one. When Abraham gives a tenth of everything to this priest of Salem, he establishes a permanent monument long after his bones are placed in the cave of Machpelah. The years flow like water as the patriarch's family wanders between the southern border and the walls of Damascus. Sarah remains barren despite the divine promise that her womb will bear nations. But when the heavenly messengers appear under the oaks of Mamre, announcing that the aged Sarah will bear the child of her destiny, the laughter of heaven is mixed with the wonder of the earth. Isaac, whose name means laughter, enters the world carrying with him the joy of an impossible promise fulfilled. On the high ground of Moriah, where the temple of Jerusalem will one day crown the mountain with cedar and gold, Abraham faces the ultimate test of faith. The divine command is distorted deeper than bronze, where he is demanded to offer his beloved son as a burnt offering. At Moriah's peak, heavenly intervention holds the patriarch's hand, while steel floats above Isaac's throat. A ram caught in the bush dies in the boy's place, and the divine voice renews the oath. Isaac grows to manhood, bearing the marks of a miraculous birth. At the well of Beersheba, he takes Rebekah as his wife, a beautiful girl brought from the distant plains of Mesopotamia. Before birth, twin sons struggle in Rebekah's womb, forming through conflict the nation that is not yet born. Esau appears first, red and hairy, then Jacob holding his twin's heel as if already advancing for the blessing. At Beersheba, where the desert wind speaks secrets as old as time, Jacob receives his grandfather's inheritance, which transforms a stone pillow into a gateway between earth and heaven. Angels ascend and descend the heavenly staircase as the divine voice renews the sacred covenant. During 20 years of service in Mesopotamia, Jacob is taught a lesson that no father could have commanded. During the years of exile, 11 sons and 1 daughter are born from his loins. Their descendants will become the tribes that bear their names. At the ford of the Zabbok, Jacob meets his adversary in supernatural combat, transforming him from a supplier to a prince. All night long, he wrestles with a man whose nature is shrouded in mystery. When dawn touches the eastern mountains, the wrestler is given a new name. Jacob is no more, but one who has won a struggle with God. Of Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph shines with grace, turning the jealousy of his siblings into a murderous flame. The dream of kneeling before his glory strikes their hearts like a poisonous arrow. When opportunity presents itself in the fields of Dothan, they sell him to Ishmaelite merchants to go to the markets of Egypt. This son of fate sinks into slavery, his many-colored torn and bloodied garments to deceive his father.
Yet the divine wisdom of heaven works through human evil as light refracts through crystal. In Potiphar's house, Joseph rises to be a steward through faithful service. When his master's wife sets a trap of temptation in his path, the young Hebrew chooses honesty over advancement. Her rejection ignites his wrath with false accusations, sending him to Pharaoh's prison. Even in captivity, divine favor falls upon Joseph like the dew of the morning. When Pharaoh's butler and baker have distressing dreams, Joseph uses the keys of heaven to unlock their meaning. 2 years later, when dreams haunt the ruler of Egypt with dreams of fat and lean cattle, no magician can interpret their significance until the butler remembers the Hebrew captive. Standing before Pharaoh in borrowed clothing, Joseph interprets the king's dream with authority flowing from the throne room in heaven. The 7 years of plenty will give way to 7 years of famine that will consume the memory of prosperity. At the age of 30, Joseph rides out of Memphis in Pharaoh's second chariot as heralds weep before him. From the green fields of the Delta to the rocky cataracts of the Swan, all of Egypt bows before this administrator whose wisdom saves their people from starvation.
When famine sweeps across the ancient Near East, only Egypt has sufficient reserves. From the mountains of Canaan, where Jacob's flocks are thin, 10 sons journey south to buy bread. Only Benjamin remains at home, protected by his father's love from the danger that has engulfed Rachel's firstborn son. After testing their hearts through imprisonment and accusation, after Judah presents himself for Benjamin's safety, Joseph can no longer maintain his disguise. When he announces his identity and asks if his father is still alive, a burst of recognition comes like a thunderbolt. The divine mathematics that transforms human evil into future salvation flows through his explanation. God had sent him forth to save lives during the years of famine. Pharaoh's joy at this revelation exceeds even the astonishment of the family. The royal system provides carriages for the journey. While gifts flow like water from a fountain on the hills of Canaan, news defies belief and flows swiftly that Joseph is still alive and ruling all of Egypt. When the old patriarch sees the royal carriages filled with food, his spirit is revived at the well of Beersheba. Jacob makes a sacrifice to receive heavenly guidance. In a vision of the night, a divine voice brings assurance. 70 souls descend to the borders of Egypt. Jacob and his sons, their wives and children, the entire family carries the sacred inheritance to a foreign land. At the borders of Goshen, father and son embrace as 22 years of separation fade away like the morning mist. When death finally takes Jacob, his burial place rivals royalty. A cortege triumphs from Goshen to Hebron, carrying the patriarch home to be laid to rest beside Abraham and Sarah in the cave he purchased at Machpelah. Joseph's own death at the age of 110 marks the end of an era when the covenant heirs lived safely under the protection of Pharaoh. But over time, changes come to the land of the Nile. A new king emerges who does not know Joseph or remember the Hebrew administrator who saved the nation from famine. This new regime imposed hard labor on the descendants of Abraham, forcing them to build cities of wealth with bricks made of delta mud and straw. Yet the more they oppressed the Hebrew people, the more they multiplied.
When forced labor failed to stop their growth, Pharaoh ordered the midwives to kill all Hebrew male children at birth. Finally, in desperation, he issued a decree. Every male child born was to be thrown into the Nile River. In this darkness, a child was born whose survival defied the royal edict. When Amram of the Levite family took Jochebed as his wife, their union produced a son so beautiful that his mother hid him for 3 months. Rather than surrender him to the starving waters of the Nile, when secrecy became impossible, faith took the form of a waterproof basket woven from oxen skins. In the reeds where Pharaoh's daughter had come to bathe, the child floated like hope, riding the waters of destruction. When the princess discovered the crying child, her heart was moved with compassion that transcended political boundaries.
Moses, whose name means attracted, grew up in Pharaoh's house, where he received the best education and never forgot the suffering of his people. When Moses reached adulthood, righteous anger burned in his heart until it swallowed caution. His bronze sword found its mark on the flesh of a caretaker. The ground drank in blood, and the desert wind spread sand over the evidence of redemption, turning to murder. Fear drove Moses from his only known home into the wilderness, where his royal education meant nothing. At a well in Midian, Moses finds purpose in protection and meaning in service. His intervention earns gratitude, which results in marriage to Zipporah. For 40 years he shepherds sheep in the wilderness, where silence can never teach the lessons of palaces. On the slopes of Horeb, a divine fire burns in a bush that burns but is not consumed. From that fire came a voice that reshaped history and transformed a runaway shepherd into the greatest deliverer the covenant people had ever known. A commission that demanded more faith than Moses could muster was met with divine assurance. When the people were led out of slavery, they would worship God on this mountain. Returning to the land of the Nile, Moses set out with his wife and sons, carrying a shepherd's staff. Heaven was transformed into an instrument of wonder and judgment. Aaron met him on the mountain of God, and together the brothers brought news to their enslaved relatives that was impossible to believe. The Almighty had heard their cries and remembered his sacred bond with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Before Pharaoh's throne, Moses made the final pronouncement from heaven. The message was clear and uncompromising. The God of the Hebrews demanded the release of his people for their desert worship. But the king's response revealed the depth of Egyptian pride against divine authority and the breadth of human rebellion. What followed challenged every notion of divine power and human pride, as 10 plagues came upon Egypt like the blow of a hammer on Nehi, who refused to bow down. The water turned to blood, frogs swarmed, gnats rose from the dust, flies invaded while Goshen was untouched. Livestock died, boils broke out, stones fell like hailstones, and fire spread across the ground. The locusts devoured the remnants of the hail. Then, for 3 days, the darkness became so thick that the Hebrews lived in light. But the 10th plague would be different, striking not at comfort, but at the heart of human love. Moses declared that at midnight death would take away all the firstborn, from the heir of Pharaoh to the son of the handmaid.
On the 14th day of the first month, the Hebrews prepared for redemption through the blood of a lamb. Each family selected a 1-year-old male child without defect. In the evening, the heads of the families took the blood and put it on the doorposts, sides, and lintel. Then the meat was roasted over the fire and eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. The blood was a sign, and when the destroyer saw the blood, he would pass over them. At midnight, as the destroying angel traveled through Egypt like wings of judgment, death entered every home where the blood had not marked the doorpost. From Pharaoh's palace to the depths of the dungeon, the firstborn breathed their last, while the family's cries rose like incense of mourning. In the entire land there was not a house where no one had died. Only in song, with the blood of the Lamb had purchased life. The king, who had ignored the repeated warnings of heaven, now summoned Moses and Aaron in the darkness of that terrible night. He ordered them to leave immediately with all his people, to take their flocks and herds as they requested, and to worship their God.
600,000 men, carrying flour on foot from Ramesses, besides women and children, had not had time to get up, and their neighbors, desperate to see them go, had laid their treasures upon them. To the east they set out with the help of a pillar of cloud, which protected them from the desert sun by day, and turned into fire to light their way by night. Between Migdol and the sea at Pi-hahiroth, the people of the covenant found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's advancing army and waters so deep that they could not cross. But Moses raised his rod over waters that had never been divided, and by a display of divine power made human engineering child's play. All night the east wind blew, and divine intervention pushed the sea back until it stood like a wall on either side of the path made by the seabed. When the morning light revealed to the Egyptians the division of the sea, the chariot wheels found sand where the water should have been, in the same corridor that had become the highway of freedom for the Hebrews. Pharaoh's army marched confidently, but when the rod was raised, the wall of water broke with a thunderous roar, crushing the chariots and horses and burying them in the ground. No one was left alive to bring the news of the defeat back to the royal court. On the far shore, as the Egyptian bodies tumbled like logs after a storm, the covenant people uttered their first song of freedom. As the women danced, Miriam's tambourine rang out, and a triumphant voice rose beside them. They set out into the wilderness of Shir, carrying the bones of Joseph as their most precious treasure, while fire and cloud from heaven guided their steps toward the engagement with the mountain of God. Behind them lay 4 centuries of slavery, ended in a night of judgment from above. The 40 years of wilderness wandering that would make a nation out of slaves and write the law of heaven on tablets of stone. From the smoking peaks of Sinai, where thunder spoke the law and lightning engraved the commandments on stone, the covenant people carried the divine fire in their hearts across the desert borders toward the land of the ancient promise. When Joshua led them across the divided waters of Jordan, and the walls of Jericho fell and began to pray, victory burned across Canaan like a wildfire, as the fire of a wildfire consumes dry stubble. Yet victory remained incomplete, like a tapestry half-woven on the loom of heaven. Pockets of resistance were scattered throughout the mountainous regions and the coastal plains. Canaanite fortresses where bronze chariots roared. Philistine cities where iron weapons sang songs of technological superiority. Jebusite Jerusalem stood like an eagle's nest on its rocky throne, out of reach. Among the tribes, there was no central authority after the bones of Joshua were placed next to the bones of Joseph in the sacred ground of Shechem.
Each tribe settled in its lauded inheritance, while the Ark of the Covenant resided in Shiloh, ministered to by Levitical priests whose voices lifted the daily sacrifices to the throne of heaven. At that time, no king ruled over the children of Abraham. Each did what seemed right in his own eyes. Trials came like waves against a crumbling seawall. The nations that Joshua had not completely destroyed continued to fight the Hebrew settlements with increasing courage, while new enemies appeared on the east bank of the Jordan and the west bank of the Great Sea. When the oppression became too much to bear, the tribes cried out to the God of their ancestors, and he raised up deliverers, judges, who combined military command, civil magistrates, and prophetic voices. When the Mesopotamian invaders from the north devour the crops like locusts, the king of Judah is the first to respond to the call of heaven.
His bronze sword carves out deliverance from the foreign yoke, and his voice proclaims divine justice to the assembled multitude. 8 years of peace follow his conquest, but new threats arise to test the faithfulness of the covenant people. When the tribes again forget their divine giver and turn to wooden gods and stone altars, Eglon, king of Moab, crosses the Jordan with his Ammonite allies to exact tribute from those who have forgotten the source of their strength. For 18 years his tax collectors strip the Hebrew granaries, and his soldiers remind the conquered that the iron spear speaks louder than the ancient covenant. But Ehud, the left-handed son of Gera of the fierce tribe of Benjamin, carried more than a load of taxes when he approached Eglon's throne. Hidden beneath his robes, a long, one-handed knife awaited the moment when the private audience would turn into divine judgment. Where the Moabite king had received his Hebrew vassal, bronze flesh was found with surgical precision. The job was done. The judge fled as the guards were dismayed to discover their master's body. The trumpet of deliverance sounded across the hills of Ephraim as the tribes rallied to seize the Jordan River before the Moabite army could cross. That day 10,000 enemy warriors fell under the Hebrew bronze, but none fled to carry the news of defeat to their homeland. There was peace for 80 years after Ehud's deliverance. But memory never lasts as long as flesh, and this pattern inevitably returns with its own toll. New apostasy brought new persecution, as King Jabin of Hagar sent his general Sisera with 900 iron chariots to remind the covenant people that military technology often determined political reality. For 20 years, those wheeled fortresses had roared across the Canaanite plains, while Hebrew foot soldiers had learned to fear the sound of bronze-rimmed wheels. In those dark days when Canaanite rulers exacted tribute from trembling villages, leadership emerged from unexpected sources. The prophetess Deborah sat in court under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, dispensing justice with the wisdom flowing from a divine source. When her words carried authority, even the elders of the tribe acknowledged them. When the Spirit of the Almighty stirred in her heart, she called Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh, with a voice like a blazing fire from the altar of heaven. The time had come to break the Canaanite power and drag Sisera and his iron chariots to Mount Tabor, where the terrain would favor Hebrew strategy over foreign technology. 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun would follow Barak to victory. But Barak's reaction revealed the fear of putting iron weapons in the Hebrew heart. If Deborah had gone with him, he would have gone, but not otherwise. The prophetess agreed, though her words carried prophetic irony. Victory would bring no glory to Barak's name, for the Almighty would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman.
From the heights of Mount Tabor, the Hebrew army descended like snow as the heavens opened their floodgates and turned the Kishon Valley into a swamp that swallowed up the Canaanite chariots. Where the iron wheels had roared with authority, now they rolled helplessly in the mud as the Hebrew spears found their mark. Sejurah himself had abandoned his chariot and fled toward the tent of Heber the Canaanite. But fate was like a woman's face that day, just as Deborah had predicted. Heber's wife Giselle received the fleeing general with a hospitality that belied the deadly intent. As he slept under the protective covering of her tent, his hammer drove a tent peg through her temple into the ground. The song that followed, Deborah's victory hymn, rang out across the mountains like bronze bells celebrating divine deliverance. That great victory was followed by 40 years of peace. And yet the cycle continued, as relentless as the tide and as destructive as the plague. As the Midianites swept down the Jordan like a tidal wave of destruction, the new apostasy gathered with new enemies.
Their camel cavalry was wreaking havoc on the Hebrew heartland with a swiftness that no infantry could match. For 7 years, these desert invaders had appeared to clear the land at harvest time. Among the threshing wheat in secret places, Gideon's son Joash was threshing grain in a winepress to hide his work from the Midianites' patrols. Here, the angel of the Almighty found him, addressing this frightened farmer as a mighty warrior and commanding him to save his people from their oppressors. The answer came not in words, but in supernatural signs of fire. That night, the divine command commanded the reluctant judge to tear down his father's altar to the god Baal and to cut down the Asherah pole beside it. When the townspeople saw their temple destroyed and demanded Gideon's death, his father displayed wisdom beyond human comprehension, suggesting that if Bel truly possessed divine power, he should defend himself. When the Midianite army crossed the Jordan like locusts in a field of grain, the Spirit of the Almighty clothed Gideon's flesh, and the sound of his trumpet echoed through the tribal territories. 32,000 men responded to his call, but divine strategy required fewer men to ascend to heaven in the name of victory rather than human valor. At the water's edge, the final selection was made by a simple test of drinking technique. Those who lapped up water like dogs, remaining alert while quenching their thirst, numbered only 300. But these were the core of heaven's chosen instrument. With nothing more than trumpets, torches, and empty jars, this small force would accomplish what conventional armies could not. At midday, when the enemy camp was deep in sleep, 3 groups gathered around the Midianite camp. At Gideon's signal, the sound of a trumpet broke the silence of the night, while torches flared from broken jars and Hebrew voices proclaimed victory. Confusion spread among the enemy as terrified warriors slaughtered their own comrades in the darkness, while those who recognized disaster fled eastward. After the victory, the grateful tribes bestowed royal authority on Gideon. But the judge's response suggests a lesson that was forgotten by future generations. He would not rule over them, nor would his sons, for only the Almighty had sovereignty over the covenant people. After Gideon's death, Abimelech demonstrated the dangers of royal ambition for the tribal confederacy. Using silver stolen from the temple of Baal, he hired unworthy mercenaries to kill 70 of his relatives, clearing the way for kingship through the blood of the brotherhood. 3 years of tyranny proved the wisdom of avoiding monarchy when a woman's millstone shattered the king's skull. From Gilead came Jephthah, the son of a prostitute whose relatives had driven him out to prevent him from claiming the inheritance.
When Ammonite pressure became unbearable, the same elders who had driven him out came in search of his military skills. Before resorting to war, Jephthah tried diplomacy, sending messengers with historical arguments to demonstrate Hebrew rights to disputed territories. When diplomacy failed, Jephthah prepared for war with a promise that would tragically haunt his victory. If the Almighty delivered the Ammonites into his hands, he would offer up as a burnt offering all that came out of his house to meet him on his return. But the mockery of Helen cut deeper than human expectation. His only daughter came out to meet him, dancing with tambourines and feasting. This vow had been made before the Almighty and could not be broken. For 2 months on the mountain, the girl was given time to mourn her virginity before returning to fulfill her father's desperate vow. Her sacrifice became a memorial among the Hebrew daughters, transforming military victories into Pyrrhic victories. Into the Palestinian crisis came Samson, the last and most flawed of the great judges, whose supernatural strength flowed from divine blessing and the Nazirite vow. From birth, his destiny had been announced by angels. No razor would touch his head, no wine would pass his lips.
And through his holiness, he will begin to deliver the covenant people from Philistine domination. Samson's story seems like a long list of what could have been. His marriage to a Philistine woman from Timnath brings conflict rather than alliance. His riddle with honey from a lion's carcass, on the other hand, leads to betrayal and revenge. 300 foxes became tools of agricultural warfare when he tied their tails to torches and released them into enemy fields. When 3,000 men from Judah came to arrest him for endangering the safety of the tribe, Samson accepted the bonds rather than resist his own relatives. But at Lehi, where the Philistine soldiers had gathered to claim their prize, a surge of divine power tore his bonds apart like a burning bush. A fresh donkey jawbone became his weapon when he struck down 1,000 enemies in single combat. For 20 years, Samson ruled during times of Philistine oppression. Yet his leadership was sporadic rather than systematic. His weakness for foreign women repeatedly led him into compromising situations where personal pleasure conflicted with public duty. Finally, Delilah of Sorek became the instrument of his downfall through her constant inquiries about the source of his supernatural strength. When constant questioning weakened his heroic resolve, Samson finally revealed the truth. His strength lay in his uncut hair, a symbol of his Nazirite purity. While he lay on his knees, Delilah called a barber to shave off 7 locks. Philistine soldiers bound him with bronze chains, gouged out his eyes, and forced him to thresh grain like a beast of burden. Yet God's mercy extends beyond human failings. When his hair began to grow back after a few months of captivity, his supernatural strength returned. At the great festival where 3,000 Philistines had gathered to mock their captured enemy, the judge offered his final prayer. Standing among the pillars of the temple, Samson prayed to the Almighty for strength once last. When the strength from above returned to his arms, the temple collapsed with a thunderous crash, burying more Philistines than he had killed in his entire life. With the death of Samson, the period of the judges drew to a close, as new challenges arose that the tribal confederacy could not adequately address. At Shiloh, where the sacred Ark of the Covenant was housed in the sanctuaries of its tent, corruption spread through the priestly house like gangrene through the wounded flesh. High priest Eli, whose eyesight had grown dim with age, could not control his sons Hophni and Phinehas as they perverted temple worship for personal gain.
These corrupt priests showed no respect for the sacred offerings, taking the meat from the sacrifices before the proper portion was burned on the altar, while their servants threatened and tortured the worshippers. Worse still, they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the temple, defiling the holy ground through sexual immorality. Into this corrupt environment came Samuel, born in the barren womb of Hannah through answered prayer and devoted to temple service from childhood. As a child, he heard a voice outside calling his name in the night watches, learning to recognize the language of heaven. While the older men sat unheeded, Samuel's word proved reliable throughout the land, because the Almighty had established him as a prophet, not one of his words falling to the ground unfulfilled.
From Dan to Beersheba, all the covenant people knew that Samuel had been established as the voice of heaven for their time. But the crisis came when the Philistine army gathered at Aphek while the Hebrew army gathered at Ebenezer. On the first day of battle, 4,000 soldiers fell to Philistine iron. Desperate for divine intervention, the elders of the tribe decided to bring the ark from Shiloh, believing that its presence would ensure victory. When the ark arrived, accompanied by Hophni and Phinehas, the Hebrew war cry shook the earth, and the hearts of the Philistines turned cold with fear. Yet courage, born of despair, quickened their resistance when the commanders rallied their troops and reminded them that defeat would reduce them to Hebrew slavery. The ensuing battle shattered the Hebrews' confidence, revealing that religious objects had no power of their own apart from the grace of heaven. 30,000 foot soldiers were killed, and the ark was carried off as a trophy by their enemies. Among the dead were Eli's 2 sons, who ended their corrupt lives in which they attempted to desecrate sacred objects for military gain. But the Philistines soon learned that capturing the ark brought more curses than blessings. In the temple of Dagon in Ashdod, the image of their god fell face down before the Hebrew ark, then broke when retrieved. As rats took over their territory, tumors spread among the population. From city to city the ark moved, from Ashdod to Gath to Ekron. Wherever the hand of the Philistines had defiled his holy presence, he brought destruction. 7 months of misery taught the people of the sea that the price of some victories was heavier than the loss. Finally, the ark set out on a new cart from Philistine land. 2 milch cows separated from their calves, a test of whether the recent plague was an act of heaven or a mere coincidence. The cows headed straight for Beth Shemesh, confirming supernatural intervention. Meanwhile, Samuel had established a new form of leadership, traveling between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah to judge disputes and maintain justice. Yet even his wise leadership could not solve the fundamental problems plaguing the tribal confederacy. His sons Joel and Abijah, appointed as judges in Beersheba, proved corrupt like Eli's sons, taking bribes and perverting justice. Despite the return of the ark, the power of the Philistines remained unbroken. Their iron weapons were still superior to Hebrew bronze. Across the Jordan, the Ammonite pressure continued, while other enemies looked for weaknesses. Most ominously, the old prophet was showing signs of death when his sons demonstrated their unfitness for the succession. In this crisis, the elders of the tribe gathered at Ramah and presented Samuel with a request that would forever transform Hebrew society.
They noted his advancing age and his son's corruption, but their solution went beyond immediate concerns and addressed deeper structural issues. The time had come for the covenant people to have a king like all nations. Samuel's initial response mixed personal shepherding with theological insight. Eller's request repudiated his lifelong faithful service and demanded a change that was contrary to holy intent. When he brought their appeal to the Almighty in prayer, the response struck at the heart of the matter. The people were not against Samuel, but against the true king who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt. From the beginning of the Exodus, they had abandoned their true sovereignty and served other gods. And now they wanted an earthly king instead of heavenly rule. Yet the request would be granted, though not without warning of the inevitable cost of monarchy. Samuel's speech to the assembled elders painted a bleak picture of the claims of royal authority over free peoples.
Kings would take sons for military service and daughters for domestic service, while confiscating fields and vineyards to reward court favorites. Heavy taxes would support the royal bureaucracy, while forced labor would build palaces. The day would come when they would cry out for their king, but heaven would not answer their complaints about their chosen burden. But the elders were unmoved by prophetic warnings. Their minds were fixed on practical needs that seemed to require royal solutions. They wanted a king who would judge them and fight them to provide them with a unified leadership that would match the military organization of their enemy. Their final argument was of such weight that theological objections could not overcome it. They wanted to be like all the nations around them. The sanction from on high came with a heavy heart. When Samuel was permitted to grant their demand, yet they were again urged to warn what a king would bring. The invisible one among the tribes, the one marked for the crown, was already moving toward a destiny that would change Israel forever. The age of the judges fell not upon the hands of the enemy, but upon a choice from within to surrender the rule of the invisible for the crown of the visible. By becoming like other nations, they had gained strength and smoothness, but had lost that holy identity which had made them an asset among the people of the earth. Among the hills of Benjamin, where the silvery shade of the olive trees and the ancient paths between the terraced fields were, the prophet Samuel carried the holy oil in his horn, while divine sorrow weighed heavy on his heart. The Almighty rejected Saul to reveal the true character beneath the royal purple. Now the choice of heaven must fall upon another, whose heart beat more in harmony with heavenly purpose than with human pride. From the heights of Ramah, the old seer set out for Bethlehem by divine command. His expedition required secrecy, for Saul's jealous nature would interpret any anointing as treason against the crown. Under the guise of sacrifice, Samuel would pour oil on the head of Jesse's youngest son, a shepherd boy whose destiny would be to rebuild kingdoms. At the gates of Bethlehem, the elders trembled at Samuel's arrival, for the prophet's visit often brought judgment on hidden sins. But his words were peaceful, as he invited them to sanctify themselves for holy worship.
Jesse of Bethlehem came with his family, 8 sons standing in line by birth, as their father presented each one for prophetic inspection. The eldest son, Eliab, was tall and strong, his warrior body hinting at royal potential that caught Samuel's eye like sunlight on polished bronze. Of course, there was a sign of divine election for this firstborn son, but the voice of the Almighty spoke in whispers of correction. Man sees the outward appearance, but the Creator sees the secret chambers of the heart, where true character resides. One by one the 7 sons passed before the pilgrim, while heavenly silence met each presentation. All bore the blood and manly strength of Jesse, yet none could evoke the prophetic recognition that heaven's choice had emerged. When the parade ended without confirmation, Samuel's voice of confusion turned to urgent questions. Did Jesse have any more sons besides these 7? The father's response revealed a watchfulness born of practical necessity. The younger one tended sheep in distant pastures, his absences seeming more natural for a man whose duties were more closely tied to the flock than to ceremonial events. But sacred purposes often lie hidden in humble circumstances that defy human wisdom.
When David came in from the wilderness, the dust on his clothes and the scent of mountain sheep in his hair, something stirred in Samuel's prophetic mind like the strings of a wind harp. This ruddy youth, with his beautiful eyes and handsome face, carried himself with a calm confidence that spoke of time alone with God and of danger. Without ceremony, Samuel lifted his horn of oil and poured it on David's head while his family watched in amazement. The sacred liquid rolled down the shepherd's face like rain on a thirsty ground, marking him before heaven's chosen witnesses who did not yet understand its significance. From that day on, the Spirit of the Almighty descended upon David as he departed from Saul like the breath of a dead man. The rejected king found himself tormented by an evil spirit that brought despair and rage, fear and paranoia that no royal physician could cure. In desperation, his servants consulted the healing powers of music, seeking a skilled harpist whose melodies could soothe their master's troubled mind. When the courtiers recommended David's son Jesse as both a skilled musician and a valiant warrior, they unwittingly arranged a meeting between the anointed successor and the reigning sovereign that would set the wheels of destiny in motion. At Saul's court in Gibeah, the melody of David's harp dispelled the torments of evil spirits, and his presence brought peace to rooms echoing with the echoes of royal anguish. Yet David's true introduction to national fame came not through the royal court, but on a battlefield where the Philistines challenged covenant beliefs. In the valley of Elah, where the 2 armies faced each other across a narrow valley, Goliath of Gath advanced every morning and evening for 40 days. His bronze armor shone like sunlight, while his voice thundered. At 9 feet 9 inches, Goliath stood, his manly robe weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze, while the iron point of his spear weighed 600 shekels. The giant's challenge cut deeper than mere military strategy, striking at the heart of covenant theology that proclaimed divine superiority over earthly powers. His defiant words demanded that the army of the living God choose a warrior to face him. Into this crisis came David, sent by his father to provide provisions for his brothers in Saul's army.
When he heard Goliath's challenge and saw tribal paralysis in the face of Philistine pride, righteous anger burned in his heart like a fire burning. The questions the young men among the soldiers asked revealed both practical interest and theological insight. Who was this uncircumcised dog that he should defy the army of the living God? When Eliab heard his younger brother's question, jealous anger moved him to publicly rebuke him. He accused David of abandoning his sheep to watch the battle, of pride and wicked curiosity. But the shepherd's response deflected family criticism and kept the focus on the challenge that had paralyzed resistance. David's bold questioning reached Saul's ears like the wind carrying news of distant thunder. When the ruler summons this young man, who is not impressed by the strength of the Philistines, he finds himself confronted with a confidence that reminds him of his own early days, when divine power transformed him from donkey hunter to national savior. Yet Saul's initial reaction reveals how completely fear has corrupted royal courage. David was only a young man, and Goliath had been a warrior since his boyhood.
This inconsistency seemed so obvious that the duty of sovereignty demanded that this young volunteer be protected from suicidal overconfidence. But David's testimony presented a different picture of divine protection and proved heroism. When the lion threatened his father's flock, his own hand caught them and killed them. When the bear wanted to carry off the lamb, his strength rescued the prey and slew the hunters. The God who had saved him from the claws and fangs of beasts had also saved him from the spear and sword of the Philistines. 5 smooth stones from the river would serve as ammunition for the sling that had protected David's flock through countless nights of danger. As the son of Jesse walked across the valley toward his giant adversary, each step took him further away from human calculation and deeper into sacred mystery. Goliath's reaction to this unexpected warrior was a mixture of joy and indignation. The tribe had chosen a clearly inadequate representative in despair. The giant's words stung with contempt as he scorned his young opponent's youth and lack of suitable weapons, threatening to hand his flesh over to the birds and beasts for food. But David's response transformed the physical clash into a theological battle. His words, bearing his prophetic authority, echoed across the valley like trumpet blasts. Goliath came with sword, spear, and javelin, relying on bronze and iron. But the young warrior came in the name of the Almighty, the God of the armies the Philistines had defied through 40 days of humiliating challenge. The clash itself unfolded with astonishing swiftness. As Goliath advanced with measured steps, David rushed toward him, his voice careening through the air like deadly music composed in the arsenal of heaven. The stone flew true to its divine direction, striking the giant's forehead with such force that it drove it deep into his skull. For a moment, as long as eternity, Goliath stood at attention as his massive body fought against its destruction. Then he fell to the ground like a shattered cedar, his armor clanging against the stone, while his soul fled toward whatever death awaited those who denied the living God.
Without hesitation, David ran to the fallen giant and drew the great sword from its sheath. The blow that followed separated the head from the shoulders as the two armies watched their worlds reshape themselves around this moment of impossible victory, which demonstrated divine power through faithful courage. When the Philistine army saw their hero fall, panic spread through their soldiers as fire consumes dry grass. The withdrawal began as a tactical retreat, but quickly became a rout as tribal war cries echoed across the valley. And Saul's army pursued their fleeing enemies to the gates of Ekron and Gibeah. That day, David's fame was established throughout the kingdom and brought him to reside permanently at Saul's court. The king made him leader of the men of war, despite his youth. But success created complications that could not have been innocently expected, for royal favor proves as dangerous as sovereign displeasure when jealousy corrupts the heart. The victory song that the women sang on their return from the slaughter of the Philistines contained songs that delighted the people and poisoned the heart of their ruler. Their voices declared that Saul had killed his thousands, while David had killed his 10,000s, comparing success in a way that reveals a shift in popular allegiance.
From that day on, the restless emperor viewed his young general with suspicious eyes. Yet the heavenly future continued to weave patterns that could not break human hatred. Saul's own son, Jonathan, saw his soul linked to David by friendship beyond political calculation. The heir to the throne loved his father's general as his own soul, entering into a covenantal bond that included the exchange of robes and armor, swords, bows, and belts. But Saul's deteriorating mental state transformed cautious suspicion into murderous intent, as evil spirits returned to torment the restless king. When David played the harp to soothe the royal anguish, Saul twice hurled his spear at the musician, intending to pin him to the wall with bronze that whistled past its target. Only divine protection and quick reflexes saved the anointed from being killed in the guise of accidental violence. Realizing that direct assassination would be difficult, Saul chose a more subtle approach, promoting David to captain of 1,000, hoping that military duty would give the Philistine spearmen an opportunity to fail to obtain the royal weapons. But the young commander's success in each endeavor only increased his popularity, demonstrating heavenly blessing. Marriage became Saul's next weapon because he gave his daughter, Michal, to David with the understanding that a royal son-in-law would face greater military risks. The sovereign expressed his willingness to give her in marriage without the customary bride price. Only 100 Philistine foreskins were required as proof of military prowess. Yet David's response exceeded royal expectations, while proving that divine favor could not be calculated by human mathematics. In due time, he returned with 200 foreskins taken from the corpses of Philistines, proving his eligibility for royal marriage and further establishing his reputation as a warrior whom heaven had blessed with victories. The subsequent marriage bound David to Saul's family through a bond that was supposed to ensure mutual loyalty, yet further increased the ruler's fear. Michal's love provides her husband with protection from palace intrigue, but when jealousy overcomes paternal affection, it gives his father new opportunities for maneuver. As David's fame spreads throughout the kingdom and beyond, Saul's mental decline accelerates until all pretense of affection disappears into open hostility. He orders Jonathan and all his servants to kill David, abandoning subtlety for direct action. But the prince's warning allows the intended victim to escape, while the heir tries to reconcile his father with reason. For a moment, Saul swears by the Almighty that David will not die. The reconciliation seems genuine, allowing the young general to return to court duties. But peace was short-lived, for renewed warfare with the Philistines provided new opportunities for the hero's valor to shine forth, further fueling the sovereign's jealousy. When Saul was again tormented by evil spirits during one of David's musical performances, the king's spear struck the wall again, and his target fled. That night, Michal helped her husband escape through a window, and her father placed an idol in their bed to deceive the soldiers sent to arrest him. The escape transformed David into a fugitive whose survival depended on divine protection and human loyalty among those who recognized heaven's choice, despite political circumstances. In Ramah, where Samuel had conducted his school for prophets, the exiles found temporary refuge, while the old seer learned how completely Saul's kingdom had fallen apart.
When the messengers came to arrest David at Ramah, the Spirit of the Almighty came upon them, compelling them to prophesy instead of seizing their quarry. The same heavenly intervention affected the second and third delegations, until finally Saul himself arrived to complete the task. Yet the restless ruler found himself stripped of his royal dignity because the holy power had overcome his hostile intentions. From Ramah, David fled to Gibeah, where Jonathan met him in secret council that would test friendship against family loyalty. The test they had planned was the fugitive's absence from the new moon feast, where his place at the royal table would reveal the sovereign's true intentions. While David's empty seat had caused Saul to ask fierce questions, Jonathan's diplomatic answer about family obligations in Bethlehem ignited a fire of royal anger that removed all doubt about the king's intentions. Saul's words revealed not only a murderous plan, but also prophetic insight. As long as David lived, Jonathan's kingdom would never be established. The signal Jonathan gave David the next morning confirmed their worst fears and solidified their covenant bond. With tears of sorrow for a friendship that political necessity would sever, the prince and the fugitive exchanged a final oath of mutual protection that would endure beyond death. From that day on, David became a fugitive leader whose court was filled with disgruntled and indebted bitter souls who found hope for better days under his leadership. In the cave of Adullam, 400 men gathered around the chosen one of heaven, while the pursuit of Saul continued across the desert. Among those who joined David's party was Athar, the sole survivor of Saul's massacre at Nob, where the mercy of the mythological to the fugitive had taken the lives of 85 priests. This atrocity marked the ruler's complete departure from heavenly favor, as he shed innocent blood for personal vengeance. Yet even in exile, David displayed the character that marked him as heaven's choice for leadership. When the opportunity arose to kill Saul in the cave of Enidir, where the king had entered alone and unprotected, The fugitive, as a proof of his restraint, cut off a corner of the royal robe and subdued the violent council of his men. The ensuing conflict revealed both David's nobility and Saul's recognition of his inevitable succession. When the exiles called upon the departing emperor with evidence of respect and pity, the reaction of the restless ruler was to acknowledge that his pursuer must be crowned and to beg protection for his family. Twice more such opportunities came to him. Once where David had entered Saul's camp and taken the royal spear and water jug while the king was asleep. And again when circumstances presented an opportunity for revenge which the anointed refused to accept. Each incident demonstrated divine protection for both pursuer and pursued. But even David's patience had its limits, and the constant pursuit eroded his faith, until despair forced him to seek refuge among the Philistines. In Gath, where the memory of Goliath still haunted the enemy council, Achish gave refuge to tribal exiles whose reputation had transcended regional boundaries. For 16 months, David lived in Philistine territory, maintaining his band of followers and protecting his family from Saul's relentless hostility. This arrangement benefited both sides.
Achish gained a valuable ally whose knowledge of tribal tactics strengthened Philistine military power, while the fugitives found rest in their constant flight. Yet divine purpose worked even in the midst of this apparent apostasy. For David's campaign against the southern tribes brought sacred good, who threatened both covenant and Philistine interests. As Achish prepares to join the other Philistine lords in the final battle against Saul's forces, only the dubious objections of his fellow commanders prevent the exiles from facing an impossible choice. On Mount Gilboa, where the Philistine victory ends Saul's tormented reign and Jonathan's noble life, the first test of tribal monarchy ends in a disaster that confirms Samuel's warning about royal government. The ruler who began with this promise dies by his own sword rather than keep quiet. When his heir dies defending a crown he will never inherit, when news of the disaster reaches David in the Philistines, his reaction reveals the greatness that will characterize his own reign. There is no joy in the fall of enemies. There is no satisfaction in the righteous sufferers, but rather a genuine grief for the fallen sovereign and the slain friend that transforms political triumph into personal tragedy. David's dirge becomes a masterpiece of tribal poetry that signals the mourning of a nation and preserves the memory of a noble deed despite tragic consequences. Saul and Jonathan, beautiful and graceful in life, were undivided in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, yet they fell on high, while their weapons of war perished with them. The way is now open for heaven's chosen leader to claim his throne. Yet David's ascension to Hebron will prove as perilous as his exile. From the ancient well in Hebron, where Abraham had lived in peace with neighboring peoples, the shepherd warrior will begin his reign over Judah when civil war breaks out in the northern tribes who have followed Saul's surviving son to Hebron, where Abraham had once lived in harmony with his people. David begins his reign over Judah while the northern tribes are caught up in civil war. Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, claimed the throne of Israel with the support of Abner, the former king's military commander. For 7 years, brother fought brother, while the covenant people bled in a conflict that served no divine purpose. Yet heaven's choice could not be thwarted by human resistance. When Abner quarreled with Ishbaal over a concubine named Rizpah, the commander's wounded pride led him to secretly negotiate with David, who had sustained the dynasty of Saul and now offered to deliver all Israel into the hands of heaven's anointed ruler. But Joab, the shepherd king's nephew and military chief, could not forgive Abner for killing his brother Asahel in the previous battle, and killed the rebel commander at the gates of Hebron. The assassination that was supposed to strengthen David's position revealed his character as he publicly mourned Abner and ordered all Israel to acknowledge the tragedy. When 2 of Ishbaal's generals murdered their master in his bed and brought his head to the king, hoping for a reward, the new sovereign's response revealed his commitment to justice rather than political expediency. Both murderers died for their treachery, while their victims were given an honorable burial.
After the opposition was removed, the northern tribes came to David in Hebron and anointed him ruler over all Israel. At the age of 30, he began reigning in Judah. He would rule the United Kingdom for another 33 years, which would become the center of the world. But first, that capital had to be conquered. Jerusalem, still known as Jebus, stood on a rocky hill like an eagle's nest, protected by walls that had never fallen during a siege. The Jebusites mocked the royal army, declaring that even their blind and lame could defend the city from any attack. Yet the new sovereign saw what others had missed. A water ditch led from the city to the spring of Gihon, providing access for those brave enough to climb its treacherous path. Joab led the attack through the tunnel, his men emerging like materialized ghosts from the stones within the walls of Jerusalem. The city, which had been impregnable since the time of Abraham, fell to the king's forces while its inhabitants watched their impregnable fortress become the capital of a united kingdom. Strategically, the choice was brilliant. Jerusalem lay between Benjamin and Judah, a territory neither side claimed. No lineage could claim the ancient rights of the city that David had conquered, making it a truly neutral ground where former enemies could serve a common sovereign. Here, the shepherd warrior set up his palace and brought with him the symbol of the divine presence that would transform a Jebusite stronghold into the holy city of the covenant people. But even before the ruler could bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, the Philistine army had advanced to crush the kingdom in its infancy. These seafaring people, who had dominated the coast for generations, realized that the king's success threatened their expansion into the land. In the valley of Rimmon, their forces gathered like locusts, ready to devour the harvest of Hebrew unity. The king asked the Lord if he would attack, receiving divine assurance that the Philistines would be delivered into his hands. The ensuing battle shattered the confidence of the enemy when the sovereign led their forces to a decisive victory, pursuing the fleeing Philistines from Geber to Gaza and destroying their idols with fire, declaring the supremacy of heaven over foreign gods. The Philistine attack, for the second time, was headed for an even more dramatic defeat when the ruler, standing by their army, heard the sound of advancing in the tops of the mulberry trees. This was a sign that the Lord himself had gone out before them to defeat their enemies.
These victories established the royal military reputation and secured Israel's borders against their most persistent enemies. With the external threat removed, the king turned his attention to the sacred work that would define the spiritual significance of his reign. At Kiriath Jearim, where the Ark of the Covenant had rested for 20 years since the return from Philistine captivity, preparations began with due ceremony to bring God's presence to Jerusalem. For the first time, everything had fallen apart, a painful lesson in the holiness of God's claim to holiness. Deep reverence when the oxen pulling the new cart stumbled, Uzzah stretched out his hand to steady the ark and died instantly, struck down for touching something that no human hand should handle. The sovereign's anger at this interference gave way to fear, causing him to redirect the ark to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it remained for 3 months.
But the divine blessing on Obed-Edom's family encouraged the king to complete the sacred task with due reverence. This time, the Levites carried the ark on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded, and the ruler himself, wearing a linen ephod, danced with all his might before the Lord. Every 6 steps, sacrifices were made as the golden box, symbolizing the presence of heaven, advanced through the streets of Jerusalem. The celebration welcoming the ark's arrival transformed the entire city into a temple of praise. Musicians and singers, priests and people joined in the worship that echoed off the walls as the king distributed food to every person in Israel. But not all hearts rejoiced at this scene, for Michal, Saul's daughter and queen, was looking on from her window with disdain at the disrespectful conduct of a king. Her criticism, when the sovereign returned to bless his household, revealed the gap between the old royal attitude and the new covenantal kingship. Michal had disdained her dancing before the maids, declaring it shameful for a king to present himself as a mere artist. But the ruler's reaction showed that he understood that divine approval was more important than human dignity. If the Lord had chosen her for his father's house, she would have been even more disgraced. That night, when the festivities had died down, the noise had died down, and Jerusalem had fallen asleep around the tabernacle where God's presence now dwelt, the king's heart burned with the desire to rebuild the city's fortunes. While his ark lay under the curtains of the tabernacle, the emperor felt the disparity between his own comfort and the ordinary accommodations provided for the throne of heaven on earth. When the prophet Nathan was consulted about the royal desire to build a temple, he at first encouraged the project with human wisdom that seemed to support royal piety. But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan with a message that would echo through generations yet unborn, establishing promises that earthly kingdoms could not hold. The divine response to the temple proposal carried both denial and affirmation that transformed despair into eternal hope. The Lord reminded Nathan that he had never asked for a house of cedar in all his journey with Israel from Egypt to the present day. He who had raised the shepherd king from following sheep to become prince over a people appointed by him would establish a house indeed, but not a building made by human hands. Instead, the Lord would build the ruler a house in the true sense, a dynasty that would outlast the lifespan of cedar and stone. The sovereign son would build the temple in his father's place, while the royal throne would be established forever before the divine presence. This covenant also surpassed the promise made to Abraham.
for it spoke not only of countless descendants, but of an eternal kingdom ruled by the chosen race of heaven. In response, the king prayed with gratitude and humility, acknowledging human weakness and honoring divine loyalty. Sitting before the ark in the tent he had set up, the ruler marveled that God would make such a promise to the house of his servants, a covenant greater than anything he had seen or heard, establishing the royal line as the conduit through which divine purposes would flow to all nations. The next event on the battlefield proved that heaven was on the side of the king to whom such a promise was made. The royal army swept across the ancient Near East as fire devours dry grass, defeating the enemies who had threatened Israel for generations. The Philistines were subjected to tribute, their coastal cities recognizing the Hebrew superiority that had been the opposite of the terrors they had faced for centuries. When King Hadadezer of Zobah attempted to reassert his dominance along the Euphrates, he found his army scattered. His 1,000 chariots and 7,000 horsemen fell to Hebrew bronze when the emperor cut down but 100 of the captured horses.
When Damascus sent forces to aid Zobah, they too were defeated before the advancing army. Their city became another tributary, providing silver and gold to the treasury of Jerusalem. King Toi of Hamath, sensing the shift in regional power, sent his son Yehoram with gifts of precious metals that acknowledged royal superiority without the need for military victory. These conquests brought wealth beyond previous Hebrew imagination, which flowed into the treasury of Jerusalem. In his later years, the king demanded a census that revealed both the power of his kingdom and the arrogance that would invite judgment. Despite Joab's objections and the resistance of other leaders, he insisted on counting the numbers of Israel and Judah, showing faith in the military might of the invisible hand that guided them. When the plague that followed this sin spread like wildfire through Israel and killed 70,000 people in 3 days, the king was moved to buy the farm of Araunah, seeing the innocent people suffer for his sin. Here, where the angel's sword had been stopped by mercy from above, the king built an altar and offered sacrifices to stop the plague, consecrating the land where his son would one day build the temple. It was no accident that the farm was on the summit of Mount Moriah, where Abraham once stood with knife in hand, ready to sacrifice his son, until a ram appeared in the thicket, which turned grief into mercy. This same mountain, marked by faith and surrender, would now contain the presence of God, not in a man-made temple, but in one formed by a higher blueprint. As the sovereign's power waned and questions of succession sparked palace intrigue, the fourth son, Adonijah, attempted to claim the throne through political maneuvering that was supported by Joab and the priest Abiathar. But Nathan and Bathsheba reminded the aging king of his oath to make Solomon his heir, leading to the young prince's coronation at the spring of Gihon. While the celebrations of his rivals were tempered by fear, the ruler's ultimate responsibility to Solomon carried both practical wisdom and spiritual insight that would guide the young king through the challenges ahead. As his age declined, the sovereign emphasized the importance of keeping the Lord's laws and following the path ordained by heaven, assuring him that obedience would preserve the dynasty.
But he also provided detailed instructions for the construction of the temple and the system of Levitical service that would transform Solomon's reign into a golden age of covenant worship. After reigning for 40 years, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem, when the king died, he left his son a unified kingdom and more than wealth. Raised from the flock, the shepherd king created a vision of rule in which sacred purpose was combined with human accountability, creating structures that would endure beyond his lifetime and would remain with him in the city he had consecrated. Solomon's ascension to the throne ushered in Israel's most prosperous era, when the promises made to Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation would be fulfilled in earthly terms. The wisdom that the new ruler would request at Gibeon, the temple that he would build according to his father's plan, and the glory that would make his reign legendary among the nations, all emerged like the sunrise after a long night of preparation. When Solomon died after 40 years of unprecedented prosperity, the kingdom he left behind was as glittering as gold, but royal wisdom was groaning under the burdens placed on unwilling shoulders.
The magnificent temple crowned the heights of Jerusalem with cedar and bronze, while trade routes brought in foreign wealth from distant lands. Yet, beneath this golden surface, beneath the ashes, resentment burned like fire, waiting for the spark that would ignite the flames of civil war. Solomon's chosen successor, Rehoboam, journeyed north to Shechem, where tribal representatives had gathered to confirm his inheritance. This ancient site where Abraham first received divine promises and where Joshua renewed the covenant, now bore witness to the negotiations that would determine whether the united monarchy would survive or be divided into rival kingdoms. The delegation that met the new ruler was prepared with grievances that had accumulated during Solomon's reign. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had fled to Egypt after leading the earlier resistance to royal policy, now returned to express the demands of the northern tribes. His words carried the weight of popular discontent that wise leadership could have addressed through compromise and reform. While acknowledging Solomon's greatness, the petitioners also drew attention to the heavy toll his achievements had taken on them. The forced labor to build the temple and palace, the heavy taxes that financed international trade and diplomatic marriages, the administrative districts that broke down traditional tribal boundaries. All of these innovations created prosperity at the expense of the ancient freedoms that the covenanted peoples cherished. Their request struck at the heart of royal rule because they asked Rehoboam to lighten the heavy yoke imposed on them by his father. If the new king would reduce their obligations to serve and reduce the burden of taxes, they would serve him as faithfully as their ancestors had. This proposal represented a reasonable compromise that recognized both royal authority and popular right. But Rehoboam's response revealed how completely royal privilege had corrupted those born into power. When he requested 3 days to consider their petition, delay meant either cautious consideration or dangerous overconfidence in his ability to dictate terms to those who had already expressed a desire to resist. The subsequent council exposed a generational divide between those who had earned their positions through service and those who assumed authority without understanding their responsibilities. The older men who had served Solomon when he came to power understood the delicate balance between royal privilege and popular consent that was essential to effective rule. Their advice reflected decades of experience in managing the tensions that arise when traditional societies face rapid change. They advised the young ruler to accept the people's requests, to speak kind words that would win their hearts and ensure their enduring loyalty. A king who served the legitimate interests of his people would find them eager to serve their legitimate authority in return. But the young men who had grown up in the luxurious surroundings of the palace with Rehoboam gave different advice that revealed their ignorance of political realities outside the royal court. These advisers who had never known, desired, or felt the burden of forced labor urged the heir to demonstrate his superiority over his father by a more stringent policy that would crush any hint of resistance. Their words oozed contempt for the common people, whom they regarded as mere resources to be exploited, rather than citizens whose consent legitimized royal rule. They advised Rehoboam to tell the petitioners that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist. Where Solomon had punished them with whips, his son would punish them with scorpions. The metaphor revealed more than its speakers, portraying royal authority as an instrument of punishment rather than protection, turning rule into a contest of wills between ruler and ruled. Such attitudes might temporarily prevail through superior power, but they inevitably created resentments that destroyed kingdoms from within. When the 3 days were up and the tribal representatives returned for the royal response, the election between Rehoboam's wise and foolish counsel would reshape the map of the ancient Near East.
When the young sovereigns arrived, their words showed how privilege could blind even the wisest to the consequences of their actions. Speaking with youthful arrogance, confident in his own invincibility, the heir declared that he would indeed make their yoke heavier than his father's. Where Solomon had punished them with whips, his son used scorpions to enforce obedience. The response revealed a complete ignorance of the political forces that had first brought the delegation to Shechem. When the 10 tribes renounced their allegiance to the family of the shepherd king, the response was swift and decisive, echoing earlier rebellions against royal authority. They declared their independence with a slogan that had spurred earlier resistance movements. They had no portion in the son of Jesse. They had no inheritance in his descendants. While the rejected dynasty looked after their own houses, let each man return to his tent. From that moment on, the covenant people were divided into 2 kingdoms, and the unity they once knew was never to be restored. The 10 northern tribes chose Jeroboam as their ruler, establishing a separate monarchy that controlled the greater part of Solomon's former territory. Only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, creating a southern kingdom centered on Jerusalem and its temple.
This division went beyond political conflict. It revealed conflicting visions for the future of the covenant community. The North adopted a traditional model that emphasized tribal autonomy and popular participation in governance, while the South maintained a dual monarchy with an emphasis on centralized authority and dynastic succession. Rehoboam's attempt to reassert control through military force ended in disgrace when the northern tribes stoned Adoram, the official responsible for forced labor, forcing the southern ruler to flee Jerusalem in his chariot. This symbolic rejection of royal oppression through violence showed how completely the heir had miscalculated the depth of popular resistance to Solomon's policies. Divine intervention prevented the civil war that would have destroyed both kingdoms before they could be established as viable states. Through Shemaiah, the almighty prophet commanded Rehoboam and his followers not to wage war against their relatives, for this division itself was ordained by heaven as a judgment for Solomon's apostasy. Immediately, the northern kingdom faced challenges that shook its ability to stand on its own. Jeroboam's subjects naturally looked to Jerusalem for religious guidance. Since the temple and its priesthood were located in the southern region, the annual festivals that had attracted pilgrims from all over the former kingdom now posed a political threat to northern independence. The new ruler realized that religious loyalty could easily be transformed into political loyalty, undermining his authority if his people continued to worship in Solomon's temple. His solution revealed both political shrewdness and spiritual blindness, for he created alternative centers of worship that would keep his subjects' devotion centered within his own borders. At Dan in the far north and Bethel near the southern border, Jeroboam set up golden calves that he proclaimed to be the gods who had freed the people from slavery in Egypt. The choice of symbols carries historical resonance, for these were the same images that had once enticed the covenant people during their wilderness wanderings.
But the northern ruler calculated that familiar religious forms would ease the transition from temple worship to his new system. Jeroboam's innovations cut deeper than ceremony. He handed over the priestly duties to non-Levites, a clear departure from the Mosaic command to reserve that role for Levitical families. He also instituted new festivals to compete with the celebrations in Jerusalem, creating a whole religious system that would serve his political purposes and maintain the semblance of covenant faithfulness. Yet these changes struck at the heart of the religious unity that had held the covenant community together since the Mosaic law was given at Sinai. The northern kingdom's innovations represented the first systematic attempt to adapt divine worship to human political expediency, setting a precedent that would eventually contaminate the spiritual foundation of both kingdoms. The southern kingdom, while retaining control of the temple and its priests, faced its own challenges as it adapted to governing a much smaller territory with fewer resources. Rehoboam's kingdom now extended from the borders of the northern kingdom to the traditional border with Egypt, which included the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin,
along with parts of Simeon in the far south. The loss of northern taxes and trade routes forced the monarchy to reconsider the policies that had once underpinned the rule of all of Solomon's empire. The wealth-building projects and international diplomacy that had financed the previous reign had now disappeared, necessitating a more modest approach to governance that would be recognized by later generations as more sustainable. Despite everything, the Southern Kingdom had preserved important resources that were essential to its continued survival. The status of Jerusalem, the city that heaven had chosen to name its name, attracted pilgrims and tribute from all over the region. Although the temple priesthood provided a continuity of ancient traditions that northern innovations could not replicate. The Davidic dynasty also carried a legitimacy that the northern monarchy of Jeroboam lacked. For the covenant promises made to the shepherd king continued to resonate in the minds of the people with the prophecies of eternal rule. Although the kingdom was divided, the royal line that heaven had established still occupied the throne where the Ark of the Covenant was. Both kingdoms faced external threats that made their division more dangerous than it would have been for a unified monarchy. Egypt, which had sheltered Jeroboam during the exile, now saw an opportunity in Hebrew weakness in the territories that had once accepted the suzerainty of the Pharaoh. In Rehoboam's 5th year, King Shishak of Egypt marched north with an Egyptian force, accompanied by a large army of Libyans and Nubians. This invasion represented the first serious external threat the divided kingdoms faced, testing whether their separate armies could defend territories that Solomon's united forces easily controlled. As the Egyptian forces advanced, Judah was hit hardest. Fortified cities fell, and even Jerusalem was threatened. This crisis forced Rehoboam to plunder the temple and royal palace of their golden treasures, using Solomon's accumulated wealth to withdraw forces that otherwise might have destroyed his capital. The humiliation went beyond financial loss, as the southern ruler replaced the golden shields that had symbolized his father's glory with bronze substitutes that announced to all observers how much the royal fortunes had declined.
This replacement served as a constant reminder that the kingdom's golden age had ended, and its consequences would be felt for generations to come. Although Egypt did not directly strike the northern kingdom, the foreign support that made it possible soon became a source of compromise. Jeroboam's debt to the Pharaoh for his refuge during the exile created obligations that limited his freedom to pursue policies that conflicted with Egyptian interests in the region. Over the years, what began as a political disagreement developed into a permanent enmity between kingdoms that shared the same ancestry, but had competing claims to represent the true covenant community. Border warfare became endemic as each kingdom sought to expand its territory at the expense of the other, while both competed for the allegiance of tribes and cities that could switch allegiances based on immediate convenience. The religious consequences of the division proved more destructive than the political effects, as competing claims to pure worship created confusion among people who had once shared common festivals and traditions. The innovations of the Northern Kingdom, while serving immediate political needs, opened the door to sectarianism and apostasy that would eventually corrupt the spiritual foundation of both kingdoms. Prophetic voices rose to denounce this division and its consequences, warning that the strength of the covenant people had always depended on their unity under divine authority. But political exigencies and royal pride hindered the reconciliation that could restore the kingdom built by David and adorned by Solomon. Generation after generation, the same divided path had been followed, with 19 northern and 20 southern kings leading the kingdoms, gradually estranged from their unified source. Neither kingdom ever again achieved the prosperity and security that the united monarchy had enjoyed at its height. Yet divine purposes continued to work through human failure. While the divided kingdoms preserved aspects of the covenant tradition that might otherwise have been lost, the North maintained strong connections to tribal traditions and people's participation in governance, while the South preserved temple worship and the Davidic lineage through which ultimate restoration would eventually come. Thus, in the tragedy of the division lay the seeds of hope for those who remembered that the same divine power that brought judgment could also bring healing to those willing to acknowledge their failures and follow in the path of their ancestors. But such restoration lay far in the future, beyond the years of conflict and apostasy that would test whether the covenant promises could withstand the consequences of human pride and political ambition. From the agreement, the divided land of man gives birth to 200 years of decline, unfolding like a scroll stained with grief and blood. The Northern Kingdom, which called itself by the ancient name of Jacob's struggle with heaven, pursued a policy that led inevitably to destruction. The southern region, clinging to the Davidic dynasty and the temple in Jerusalem, followed a more erratic path between reform and apostasy, like a drunkard stumbling into the abyss. In Samaria, the northern capital that Omri had built on a hill, purchased for 2 talents of silver, the succession of rulers exhibited the instability that plagued kingdoms based on rebellion rather than divine appointment. Coups and assassinations marked royal changes as rival factions seized power through violence, creating a pattern of political chaos that weakened the kingdom's ability to withstand external threats. The religious innovations that Jeroboam introduced to prevent his subjects from returning to the temple in Jerusalem gradually developed into something far more dangerous than mere political expediency. What began as alternative worship centers at Dan and Bethel became the gateway through which foreign influence corrupted the ancient faith that had sustained the covenant people since Moses received the law at Sinai.
Ahab's son Omri became a symbol of the spiritual decline of the northern kingdom by marrying Jezebel, daughter of Ethbal, king of the Sidonians. This political alliance, designed to strengthen ties with the Phoenician trade network, brought Baal worship into the heart of the covenant community in a way that earlier syncretism had never achieved. Raised to worship storm gods and fertility gods, the queen did not understand the exclusive claim that the God of Abraham had on his chosen people. Her efforts to establish Baal temples throughout the northern kingdom, supported by hundreds of prophets preaching foreign doctrines, represented the most serious threat to covenant faith since the incident of the golden calf in the wilderness.
Into this crisis stepped Elijah the Tishbite, whose name proclaimed that the Lord remained God despite royal apostasy. From the rugged highlands of Gilead, this prophet appeared to Ahab's court like a flash of lightning from a clear sky, declaring a drought that would demonstrate the power of heaven over the rain-making gods served by Jezebel. For 3 years the sky was sealed, while the crops withered and the rivers dried up across the northern region. The contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel became a pivotal moment when divine fire consumed the water-soaked sacrifices, and the foreign gods remained silent to their desperate servants. Even the dramatic display of heavenly power could not permanently reverse the spiritual course of the northern kingdom. Jezebel's threats also drove Elijah into exile, while subsequent rulers continued policies that gradually prepared their kingdom for the judgment that prophetic voices had repeatedly warned of. Like storm clouds on the distant horizon, Elisha, who had received the mantle of Elijah when his Lord was taken up in a whirlwind, continued a prophetic ministry that sought to remind the northern tribes of their covenant obligations. His miracles demonstrated divine mercy, as even his words proclaimed impending judgment on rulers who violated the ancient law given by Moses. But prophetic intervention could only delay the consequences of the systematic apostasy that had corrupted every level of northern society. When Jehoshaphat's son Jehuriah, son of Nimshi, received a divine commission to destroy the house of Ahab, his zealous purification eliminated Baal worship and established a new pattern of partial obedience that fell short of full reform. The revolution that brought Jehuriah to power demonstrated both the potential for change and the limitations of reform movements that addressed the signs and left the deeper problems unresolved. The new dynasty abandoned Baal worship but retained the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, creating a religious system that mixed elements of the covenant with innovations that gradually weakened the spiritual foundation of the northern kingdom. As the internal stability of the northern regions deteriorated, external pressures grew like a weight that was already approaching their breaking point. The expansion of Syria from the heart of Mesopotamia brought a military machine that had never been defeated into contact with the Hebrew kingdoms, whose fragmentation made unified resistance impossible. Shalmaneser III initially demanded tribute from Ahab, displayed Assyrian power, and allowed local rulers to maintain nominal independence while acknowledging imperial suzerainty. This arrangement was temporarily effective, but increasing tax demands and Assyrian interference in local politics gradually reduced the northern kingdom to a puppet state whose survival depended on imperial tolerance.
Tiglath-Pileser III, who had reorganized the Syrian administration with ruthless efficiency, began a systematic dismantling of the northern kingdom that led to its complete destruction. His campaigns had fragmented the northern regions, deported the population, and installed foreign settlers in a deliberate policy designed to prevent future rebellions. The final act began when Hoshea, the last ruler of the northern kingdom, attempted to throw off Assyrian hegemony by seeking Egyptian support against his imperial rulers. This desperate gamble, born of desperation rather than strategic wisdom, gave Shalmaneser V the excuse he needed to complete the destruction begun by his predecessors. For 3 years, the Assyrian siege encircled Samaria, gradually cutting off its lifeline and rendering the city too weak to resist. Within the walls, the defenders devoured everything edible and hoped for relief that would never come. When Sargon II completed the conquest begun by his predecessor, the northern kingdom ceased to exist as a political entity. The exile that followed was more than a military conquest. It was an attempt to completely erase the identity of the northern tribes so that they could never again pose a threat to Assyrian security. 27,000 captives were forcibly transferred to distant provinces, where they would blend into the local population and lose their distinct treaty traditions. To the surprise of even the Assyrians, the plan succeeded. Over time, the 10 northern tribes disappeared from the record, remembered only as mysterious lost tribes. Their destruction served as a warning to the southern regions that there would be consequences for violating the treaty. No political strategy could avoid it indefinitely. In Jerusalem, the news of Samaria's fall struck like a bolt of lightning, illuminating the darkness that royal policies had cast around the remaining kingdom. During this crisis, Hezekiah, son of Asa, who ruled Judah, realized that survival required both spiritual reform and political wisdom that could navigate the treacherous currents of imperial politics. The religious revival that Hezekiah initiated was much more than the superficial changes that had characterized previous reform movements. His workers systematically destroyed the high places and sacred pillars, the Asherah poles and the bronze serpent that had become objects of idolatry. Even the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the wilderness broke when the people began to burn incense. More importantly, the ruler of the south reopened the temple that his father Asa had desecrated and restored the priesthood to its proper function. The Passover celebration that followed attracted pilgrims from all over the region, including survivors from the northern region who recognized the temple in Jerusalem as the only remaining link to the covenant tradition. These religious reforms were accompanied by administrative and military reforms that prepared the southern region for the Assyrian invasion that everyone knew was imminent. Hezekiah's engineers built a tunnel that brought water from the cistern to the walls of Jerusalem, ensuring the capital's ability to withstand a siege. The archaeological evidence of this remarkable engineering feat still bears witness to the determination with which the southern kingdom prepared for its test. when Assyrian king Sennacherib finally turned his attention to Judah after consolidating control over the north. His invasion spread like wildfire through the countryside, consuming everything in its path.
46 fortified cities fell to Assyrian siege engines, and their populations were taken captive, promising to replicate the fate of the northern kingdom. The siege of Jerusalem then tested every aspect of Hezekiah's preparations as the Assyrian armies surrounded the city with earthworks and siege engines that never failed to reduce enemy fortifications. Within the walls, the defenders watched their food supplies dwindle, while enemy heralds proclaimed the futility of resistance against imperial power. The Sennacherib's psychological warfare included messages designed to weaken the morale of the Jews, reminding them of how easily other gods had fallen to Assyrian power. Rabshakeh spoke in Hebrew so that the common people could understand that the walls were painted with vivid imagery of the fate that awaited those who believed in divine protection against imperial realities. But the God of Abraham did not abandon his covenant people despite their failures. And the deliverance that came was evidence of divine power, working through something that no human strategy could have imagined. In one night, the angel of the Lord killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, forcing Sennacherib to retreat to Nineveh, where he was later killed by his own sons. This miraculous deliverance extended the existence of the southern kingdom by more than a century, providing time for spiritual and political developments that would shape the future of the covenant community in ways that no contemporary observer could have imagined. Yet this deliverance also created a dangerous placency among those who interpreted survival as divine approval of their current condition, rather than as a gracious opportunity for repentance. Hezekiah's son Manasseh, who ruled longer than any other Judean king, simultaneously systematically reversed his father's reforms and led the southern region into a deeper apostasy than ever before. During his 55-year reign, Assyrian religious practices were brought into the temple. The sanctuary was defiled with altars to foreign gods, and even his own son was sacrificed in the fire. Instead of learning from the fall of the north, the king repeated the same mistakes that had brought judgment upon Samaria. His persecution of faithful prophets and righteous citizens had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. Although his syncretic religious policies had corrupted the covenant faith that had sustained the community through previous crises, even in the depths of this dark age, a door remained open. Manasseh's fall under Assyrian rule led him into exile, where suffering taught him what peace was not. His final reforms, though too late to repair the damage, prove that mercy can still reach the most implacable hearts. Josiah, the grandson of Manasseh, initiated the most thorough religious reform in Jewish history when workers discovered the Book of the Law while repairing the temple. A reading of this ancient document reveals how far the covenant community had strayed from divine standards, prompting the young ruler to implement changes that touched every aspect of religious and social life. Josiah's reforms culminated in a Passover unlike any other since Solomon's, a moment of worship restored to its roots. This celebration showed what a people could become when guided by the ancient commandments, free from outside influence or personal creativity. But even Josiah's commendable efforts could not reverse the consequences of apostasy that had plagued generations. His death at Megiddo,
while attempting to dissuade Pharaoh Necho from supporting Assyrian resistance against the growing Babylonian power, marked the end of the southern kingdom's independence.
The geopolitical situation arising from the Assyrian fall created new dangers that the divided loyalties and weak institutions of Josiah's successors were unable to effectively address. Babylonian expansion under Nebuchadnezzar brought the southern region into contact with a new imperial power, at a time when internal divisions made unified resistance impossible. Jehoiakim's rebellion against Babylonian rule, encouraged by promises of Egyptian support that proved ineffective under test, provided Nebuchadnezzar with the necessary justification to begin the systematic destruction of the southern kingdom. The siege and capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC marked the beginning of the end, because the first exile had taken away skilled craftsmen and political leaders whose skills were essential to effective rule. The last ruler of the southern region, Zedekiah, was faced with an impossible situation by succession that required wisdom and faithfulness that he did not possess. His unstable policies and final rebellion against Babylonian authority completed the destruction begun by the previous mistakes, leading to the final siege that ended with the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem and the reduction of the temple itself to smoldering ruins. The exile of 586 BC brought about the complete collapse of the southern kingdom as a political power. Those who lay in the devastated land struggled to survive. They mourned not only their broken world, but also the apparent breaking of the promises their ancestors had borne through previous trials. Even in the shadow of the exile, prophetic voices announced that the story was not yet over. This was the valley before the rise of a greater hope. Jeremiah in the ruined city, Ezekiel by the river, Daniel in the halls of the empire, and others known to their companions, all clung to the faith that the one who had made the covenant would be true, even when the people did not. The Book of Lamentations and some of the Psalms captured the immediate emotional impact of the destruction, laying the foundation for the theological reflection that would sustain the covenant community through centuries of foreign domination. Their struggle with the justice of their Creator and the credibility of the Old Covenant would leave a lasting impression, shaping faith long after the nation had risen again from its shattered foundations. To the ziggurat-crowned capital of Babylon, where the Euphrates flowed past the rival gardens of heaven, and where the covenant people learned to sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land, came news that would reshape the ancient world. Cyrus the Great, king of Medos and Persia, had conquered the seemingly invincible empire that had destroyed Jerusalem and taken the best of Judah captive. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE came not through a long siege, but through strategic skill that diverted the Euphrates and allowed Cyrus's army to enter the city beneath its walls. The empire that had seemed eternal had collapsed overnight, its gods unable to protect a kingdom that trusted in bronze statues and military might rather than divine grace.
Unlike previous conquerors who had built their empires through terror and cultural destruction, Cyrus of Persia pursued a policy of tolerance that recognized the administrative value of subjects maintaining their religious traditions and local customs. This enlightened approach to imperial rule would create opportunities for restoration that no Hebrew prophet had dared to imagine in the darkest years of exile. The decree that emerged from the Persian court in 538 BC extended far beyond administrative convenience. Cyrus declared that the Lord God of heaven had given him all the kingdoms of the earth, and instructed him to build a house in Jerusalem. All covenanted individuals among his subjects could return to their ancestral homeland, taking with them the temple goods that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. This proclamation fulfilled the prophecy spoken by Isaiah 2 centuries earlier, in which Cyrus was named as the Lord's anointed shepherd, who would accomplish divine purposes despite his ignorance of the God who had exalted him to greatness. The fact that a pagan king played a key role in the restoration revealed that the power behind the story was not limited to Israel's own kings, but could operate from any throne.
The response to this opportunity reveals how profoundly the exile had changed the character and aspirations of the covenant community. Of the millions born into captivity, only a remnant chose to abandon the security they had built in Mesopotamia for the uncertainty of rebuilding the devastated region. Zerubbabel, the grandson of King Jehoiachin, who had been taken captive in the first exile, emerged as the natural leader for those who had chosen return rather than comfortable assimilation. His royal blood linked the restored community to the Davidic dynasty, while his Persian appointment as governor provided the political authority necessary for effective administration. Standing beside Zerubbabel was the high priest Joshua, a descendant of the family that had served there before the destruction of Solomon's temple. Together, these leaders represented dual authority, civil and religious, that would guide the returning exiles through the challenges of rebuilding their shattered community on ancient foundations. The first group of returning exiles numbered 42,360, with their slaves and livestock, making for a migration that rivaled the original exodus from Egyptian slavery. They carried with them not only personal possessions, but also the treasures of the temple that Cyrus had restored. The golden and silver vessels were to be used once again for worship in the place where heaven had chosen to dwell among its people. Some 15 centuries after Abraham had gone another way, the community retraced its steps back to Jerusalem, weaving their new beginnings into the fabric of their earliest history. But where the patriarchs had left civilization and gone into unknown territory, these exiles had left behind established lives to rebuild the destruction caused by their fathers' sins. Even after 70 years, the land was scarred. The walls of Jerusalem were still broken down, and the Temple Mount lay desolate, untouched by song since the day Babylon was burned. Wild beasts lived in the palaces where kings had once courted, while thorns and thistles covered the fields that had once produced grain for the royal table. Their highest priority upon their return made it clear that they understood where to begin in renewing the covenant. Before rebuilding homes or replanting vineyards, they built an altar on the Temple Mount and resumed the daily sacrifices that connected earth to heaven through smoke and flame. The burnt offering rising from this temporary altar announced that the covenant people had returned, not only to reclaim the territory, but also to restore their relationship with the God they had been driven from during their exile. The laying of the foundation stone of the Second Temple produced a mixture of joy and sorrow that captured the complex emotions surrounding this restoration. The young, who had no memory of Solomon's magnificent temple, rejoiced at the beginning of the rebuilding, while the old, who remembered the glory of the first temple, wept at the modest scale of the rebuilding. What they saw was not just a lack of gold or splendor. It suggested something beyond the architecture. The returning community lacked the resources that had financed Solomon's building projects, the political independence that had allowed previous kings to compel labor throughout their territories, and the international alliances that had supplied materials from distant lands. But opposition arose that threatened to thwart even this modest rebuilding. The mixed population that remained in the country during the exile, augmented by foreign settlers introduced by the Assyrian and Babylonian policies, claimed the right to participate in the rebuilding of the temple as fellow worshippers of the God of heaven. These Samaritans, as they were called from their center in their ancient northern capital, represented the complex ethnic and religious situation created by the exile. Their ancestors included both Israelites fleeing the exile and foreign colonists who had adopted local religious practices, creating a cohesive community that blended covenant elements with pagan traditions.
Zerubbabel and Joshua's rejection of Samaritan participation in rebuilding the temple reflected the theological concerns about religious purity that had intensified within the exiled covenant community. The returning exiles learned through bitter experience that compromise with foreign religious practices inevitably led to apostasy that brought divine judgment upon their fathers. But this decision created lasting hostility between the returning community and their neighbors, who responded to the boycott by actively opposing the construction project through political interference and economic pressure. In their complaints to the Persian authorities, the returning exiles were portrayed as potential rebels, whose temple would become a center of anti-imperial activity. The effectiveness of this opposition became apparent when work on the temple was halted for 16 years, from the second year of Cyrus to the second year of Darius. During this period, the restored community focused on rebuilding their own homes, while the temple foundations were exposed to the elements and neglect that symbolized their spiritual priorities. Divine displeasure at this delay was expressed through the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, whose messages challenged the community's excuses for postponing the rebuilding of the temple. Haggai's pointed question struck at the heart of their misplaced priorities. Was it time for them to live in paneled houses while God's house lay in ruins?
The economic problems that hindered the rebuilding of the temple were reinterpreted as divine judgments on their selfishness. Their harvests disappointed expectations, and their wages disappeared into bags with holes because they sought their own prosperity and neglected the sacred place that should have been their first concern. Zechariah's visions provided encouragement that was in harmony with Haggai's rebuke, showing the restored community that their humble efforts had cosmic significance that human eyes could not comprehend. The temple they were building might seem insignificant compared to Solomon's magnificent structure, but it would fulfill a divine purpose that would ultimately surpass past achievements. When construction resumed under this prophetic encouragement, Persian authorities initially questioned the legitimacy of the project, until a search of the imperial archives confirmed Cyrus's original approval. Darius not only allowed the work to continue, but also ordered provincial governors to provide financial support from tax revenues, transforming opposition into support through divine foresight at work within the imperial bureaucracy. The completed temple, dedicated in the 6th year of Darius's reign, lacked the gold and precious stones used in the processions of his predecessors, but rather represented something more valuable than material wealth. This sacred space symbolized a renewed commitment to the covenantal relationship of the community that had tested the exile, but not destroyed it. Temple worship was renewed, but this alone could not resolve the deep tension of preserving a distinct covenant identity in a world that was threatened. Intermarriage with neighboring peoples threatened to repeat the patterns of assimilation that had contributed to the original exile, while ignorance of divine law left many unable to distinguish between authentic covenant practices and foreign innovations. Into this crisis fell the writer Ezra, whose arrival from Babylon brought both legal expertise and imperial authority to meet the spiritual needs of the community.
With the support of Artaxerxes, he took on the task of teaching those who were willing to listen, establishing justice not according to the standards of a distant nation, but through the fundamental teachings of his own people. As Ezra read the law aloud to the assembled multitude, the emotional response of the people made clear how deeply the teachings of their ancestors had faded during the years of exile. As the community heard the words of Moses read in Hebrew and interpreted in Aramaic so that all could understand, their tears expressed both sorrow for past failures and joy at rediscovering their traditions. Later reforms addressed real problems whose solution was essential for the community's survival as a distinct nation. The problem of intermarriage required painful separations that broke up families but saved the covenant line from the assimilation that had devastated the northern tribes. These measures, while severe in appearance, echoed the hard lesson about the cost of deviating from the path they'd been told to follow during the exile. Nehemiah's arrival from the Persian court brought additional wealth and authority that enabled the community to overcome their physical weaknesses. Since Nebuchadnezzar's destruction, Jerusalem's walls had been in ruins, leaving the recovering community vulnerable to the enemies who regularly threatened their security. Rebuilding the city's defenses required more than just engineering. Diplomacy was needed to overcome the regional governors who saw Jerusalem's rise as a challenge to their power. Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official led a coalition that tried to prevent the construction of the wall through ridicule, threats, and political intervention. But Nehemiah's combination of practical organization and spiritual reliance produced a response that thwarted every attempt at sabotage. The workers rebuilding Jerusalem's defenses carried weapons as well as their tools, ready to fight for the city they were reclaiming, while at the same time trusting in the divine protection that had sustained them through previous crises. Despite persistent resistance, completed in just 52 days, the rebuilt walls testified to a power beyond human effort that even their enemies could not deny. The speed of construction and the success of the project, despite the odds, declared that heaven was still watching over the restored community with the same watchful eye that had protected their ancestors through their wilderness wanderings. The covenant renewal ceremony that followed the wall's completion brought together elements of the religious reform that had been developing since the first exiles returned to Jerusalem. Through the reading of the law, collective repentance, and a formal oath to live according to the teachings they had received from their ancestors, the community found the foundation that had been missing since the exile. This restoration represented more than political independence or religious observance. It transformed the covenant people from a kingdom dependent on human institutions into a community whose identity depended on divine law and prophetic hope. The changes imposed upon them by the exile paved the way for centuries of survival through foreign domination that would test their faith in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. By leading the way in this momentous change, the people of the Great Assembly preserved both the writings considered sacred and the interpretive knowledge needed to carry those teachings into an evolving world. Their collective memory was not built simply on myth. It carried the weight of faithfully transmitted factual traditions. The continuity between the period before and after the exile was more than just skeptical scholarship. What they transmitted was not just faith, but also new institutions and insights that would carry their descendants through the tests of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Their experience of maintaining a covenantal identity without political independence created patterns that would sustain Jewish communities through centuries of isolation. The messianic hope that developed during this period rested on the Davidic promises that had survived dynastic upheavals, but transformed them into expectations of more than political restoration. The coming Anointed One would establish a kingdom that no earthly empire could destroy, fulfilling promises that human kings had been unable to achieve. Out of exile emerged a community that learned to cherish the teachings of their heritage more than wealth, to pursue holiness more than political comfort, and to trust in a future restoration more than anything their ancestors had seen. Their suffering prepared them for a mission that would bless all people beyond their borders.
The story that began with Abraham's journey to an unknown land thus culminates not in earthly kingdoms that rose and fell like waves on the shore, but in the preservation of promises that would outlast empires and sustain hope for centuries when heaven seemed silent and heavenly purposes slept.